Hello, good afternoon to everybody east of Thunder Bay, and good morning to the west. Welcome to the Measurement and Monitoring of Safety Collaborative webinar, where we will be discussing findings of the evaluation report. Our goal today is to hear firsthand from the evaluation researchers about what they learned from the 11 teams representing 7 organizations and provinces which participated in the 18-month Measurement and Monitoring of Safety Collaborative. My name is Christopher Thrall. I am both a communications officer with and the smooth, silky voice of the Canadian Patient Safety Institute. I would like to welcome you on behalf of myself and our technical host, Alex Titsieu from CPSI. Please write any questions in the chat box on your screen. Chat them directly to me, Christopher Thrall, or in general. They will be compiled and provided to our speakers at the appropriate time. If you run into IT difficulties, please connect with us in the chat box and we would be happy to assist. If you miss part of this webinar or want to share your learnings with others in your team or organization, please know that it's being recorded and will be available on our website within the next week. There will also be a quick survey at the end of the webinar. We will be hearing from a series of outstanding speakers today, each an expert in their own areas around measurement, monitoring, and safety. Our first speaker is Wayne Miller, a senior program manager at CPSI with over 30 years of healthcare experience. He has a Master's of Healthcare Administration and is a fellow of the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement's Extra program. He was a coach with the 2017 MMSF demonstration project and is the CPSI lead for the current Measurement and Monitoring Safety Improvement project. I'll introduce our other 3 speakers in a moment, but why don't you set the stage for us, Wayne?
Thank you, Christopher. I want to start this by acknowledging that work that you will be hearing about today regarding the Measurement and Monitoring of Safety Framework is really built upon the work that was done in the UK by Professor Charles Vincent, Dr. Susan Burnett, and Dr. Jane Carthy, and the work that they did around the Measurement and Monitoring Safety Framework. And both the demonstration project and this safety improvement project that you'll hear about today comes directly from their work. The collaborative that we participated in was 18 months in duration, and it followed this form of timeline. It was a series of learning sessions. We did 3 learning sessions and a final congress, and with action periods in between. And during those action periods, we would do coaching visits to the site, along with team calls and individual huddles with the teams that the coaches were associated with. I want to give a special thanks. This whole project would never have happened without the special work and assistance of many people. Marianne Delpino was our executive lead within CPSI, Dr. Ross Baker, who has guided us as a group for many years and has been a leader in patient safety in this country. Dr. Jane Carthy and Sarah Garrett were faculty from the UK, and they were actively involved in the UK efforts around this and helped us with the demonstration project and with this particular initiative. And then Anne McLaren and Virginia Flintoff and myself were the coaches for the initiative, along with Alex's coordinating all of the aspects of the work, and then Micah Asperger's participation as a representative from Patients for Patient Safety Canada. So the Measurement Monitoring Safety Framework is, on the surface, a very simple framework. It basically is 5 dimensions that looks at 5 key areas, which has 5 associated questions. And I'm just going to run quickly through each of the dimensions just to give you an overview of the components of this. But the simplicity of the questions should not lead you to think that this isn't a very deep and thoughtful framework. So the very first dimension that we have here is past harm. This is one that we're all very familiar with in patient safety, and it's been an area of focus for most organizations for a long period of time. But what we also recognize is that even as we look at past harm, we take a very narrow view of past harm. And this is really looking in the rear view mirror. It's about looking at stuff that's already happened in the past. We typically measure things that we find easy to count. But there's a lot of aspects of harm that we never ever look at. Psychological harm, underdiagnosis, overdiagnosis, and treatment. And these are all aspects of harm that we don't necessarily look to or think about readily. The other aspect then is reliability. This is the question around are our clinical systems and processes reliable? So it's very important, and we know this from high reliability organizations, this idea that our clinical processes and systems are reliable. But inside of the framework, we really dig into what's this difference between how we imagine things should be done, the way we think things should be outlined, and what actually goes on the units and where care is delivered and what that gap is. The other component here is care safe today? And this is the sensitivity to operations dimension. And this really helps teams look at what is happening today, the patient that they have in front of them today, the care that they're providing, the work that's going on in that unit. Is care safe in that environment right now, today, as we provide it? The next dimension is, will care be safe in the future? And this is trying to look forward and anticipate concerns and troubles and try to act and be proactive about safety. And the fifth dimension is, are we responding and improving? So taking all of these components and integrating them and learning from them. One of the aspects of this framework that we have found when we were working through is people tend to look at the framework and either do it as very linear, they go around, they work around the system. And we've really struggled with that a little bit, but we've kind of been thinking a bit about it, and we liken it now to a bit of a braid, that each one of these dimensions acts like a strand. And really what you're trying to do is to weave these together to create a strong piece of rope. And as you can envision this, that piece of rope could be as tiny as something you would, an inch thick, or it could be as broad and as wide as something used to anchor a boat. But it depends upon the strength and the strands of those ropes. So developing the strength in each one of these dimensions will actually develop your ability to have a stronger and a safer environment for clients. This is a very quick overview of the aspects of the measurement and monitoring of safety. We have quite a number of resources available online, and would encourage you to check into CPSI webpage, or even just Google measurement and monitoring of safety for other resources around the framework. And Christopher, back to you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Wayne. Please remember that you can write any questions in the Q&A box on your screen, or chat them directly to me at Christopher Thrall. So chat them the chat box on your screen. Also, please chat Alex Titieu directly if you are having technical problems. I do have to interrupt our flow for a moment and sincerely apologize for neglecting a very important part of our introduction. I want to say that I'm joining from Edmonton, within Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe tribes, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. Think about the traditional territory on which you stand. I invite you to recognize all First Peoples who were here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As First Peoples have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Dr. G. Ross Baker. He's a professor at the Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto and program lead in quality improvement and patient safety. Honestly, if you have no idea who he is, a quick Google will lead you down a wondrous rabbit hole of patient safety and quality improvement projects spanning decades. Ross will be followed by our last 2 speakers, who will present their findings together. Dr. Joanne Goldman is a scientist at the Center for Quality Improvement and Patient Safety, cross-appointed researcher at the Wilson Center for Research and Education, and an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto. Leora Rateau is a program manager, also at the Center for Quality Improvement and Patient Safety, and a PhD candidate at the Institute for Healthcare Policy, Management, and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us today. Ross, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Christopher, and I want to add my welcome to everybody who's joining us on the call today. I think we're going to have a great conversation about this framework, which provides us with a new view on safety. And I'm going to move back a little to really address the issue about why do we need a new framework. And that's because for more than 20 years now, we've really worked on patient safety in Canada, the US, and many other countries around the globe. And in all those settings, there's been an enormous amount of investment of attention and resources to the issue of safety. We recognize the challenge of safety, and we've poured a lot of efforts and resources into addressing that. In Canada, since 2004, with the founding of CPSI and the publication of the Canadian Adverse Event Study, and we've been working on this ever since then. The picture you see on the screen is from a report put out by the National Patient Safety Foundation in the US in 2015 entitled Free from Harm. And they summarize this issue in the following way. Despite demonstrated improvements in specific problem areas, such as hospital-acquired infections, the scale of improvement in patient safety has been limited. Though many interventions have proven effective, many more have been ineffective, and some promising interventions have important questions still unresolved. The healthcare system continues to operate with a low degree of reliability, meaning that patients frequently experience harm that could have been prevented or mitigated. So that's the challenge we face. It's not from a lack of trying hard, it's from an incomplete understanding of what it's going to take to really address patient safety. It's going to take better patient and provider engagement with efforts from the front line to the board in order to make care better. Informed and committed leadership at all levels and greater situational awareness from frontline staff are critical in moving forward. Yet this has become increasingly challenging in the current environment with growing demands on staff and limited budgets. The bottom line is safety is an important issue, but this recognition has not translated into effective efforts to create safer care. So it was in this context, next slide please, in this context that Vincent Burnett and Carthy wrote this report in 2013 that really identified the new framework as a groundbreaking way to think about patient safety and to help us move forward into a different environment. Building on their review of work in high reliability industries and in exemplars in healthcare, this framework provides a new way of thinking about safety that Wayne explained, and it enables frontline teams as well as managers, leaders, and boards to think and act with a more holistic approach, a broader view, a multidimensional view of safety. It moves us from thinking about assurance to thinking about inquiry. How can we improve the communication, conversations, and interactions among frontline teams that probes whether care is safe and whether the care environment is supportive of safe care? And most critically, it enables frontline providers as well as leaders and boards to assess and proactively ensure safety, and thus promotes this culture of collective responsibility for safety. This idea is really reflected in that quote at the bottom of the slide, that the new framework encompasses the principal facets of safety while providing a simplicity and clarity with which to guide and inform safety measurement and monitoring. So the next slide offers us this review of the 5 questions that Wayne talked about, the critical elements of this framework moving forward. And the 11 teams in the current collaborative, or the collaborative that was completed in March, as well as the 8 teams from the earlier demonstration project, came from a wide variety of clinical environments and geographies, and they worked with guidance from the faculty and coaches to translate this framework, this conceptual way about thinking about safety, to their own settings. Now, it was a bit of a challenge for several reasons, one of which was that everybody wanted to make this into a quality improvement project. But unlike the project orientation of quality improvement, this framework asks staff to act more broadly, to think more broadly, to take on a new mindset, thinking and acting differently about their daily work and their interactions with fellow staff and managers. As you will see, despite some challenges, these clinical groups found the framework useful in seeing safety gaps and identifying ways to reduce risks. But challenges remain, both in creating and applying effective learning strategies for these teams to understand and incorporate the framework in their daily work, and in understanding how to spread and scale up these efforts to engage staff across whole programs, organizations, and regions. I think we've made huge strides in both of these areas, about the learning strategies and about spreading and scaling up. And I think these results suggest that the framework is an effective approach to closing the gap between our aspirations and our current results on safety. So now I want to turn it over to Joanne Goldman and Lior Roto, who've done the work of evaluating this framework so that they can present the results to you. Over to you, Joanne and Lior.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share our evaluation research findings with you today. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to be highlighting our findings in relation to our two main objectives. And these were to examine the effectiveness of the Learning Collaborative in increasing understanding about the framework and guiding implementation efforts, and also to examine the implementation and spread of the framework in various contexts. Our findings come from data collected through observations of 5 of the 11 sites, interviews with 36 of 51 members of the teams participating in the collaborative, observations of learning sessions, and collection of relevant documents. So I want to come back to this slide that Wayne already shared with us, and it's just really important to positioning our findings. The 18-month longitudinal nature of the collaborative, the repeated pattern of learning and action periods, and the embeddedness of coaching throughout are important to keep in mind as we speak to our results. The first learning session that took place in October 2018 really played an essential role in introducing the framework to collaborative participants. And participants spoke highly about the organization of all the learning sessions, but specifically in relation to this one, they noted the value of learning from the experts who had developed the framework and had experience implementing it in the UK, and about going through each dimension in depth and having time away from the workplace, which is, so rare to have that opportunity to really have that focused learning and to spend time with one's team discussing the framework and how it might translate to their own setting. So just sort of the complexity of thinking about the framework and having that dedicated time to that learning was really important. And overall, participants expressed a sense of enthusiasm when being introduced to the framework. And one might say that, it reflects the teams that were chosen to attend. But as, Roz and Wayne were talking about, there's this general sense of agreement with the message that an exclusive focus on past harm is not working. And that, as one person noted, the framework resonated with people because, quote, you're moving to a real-time safety place, and that's where the power in the model is. So having said that, participants described to us having 2 general types of reactions to the framework, and maybe some of you on the call are having these kind of reactions. So the first group reflected this comment. We had been given the information prior to going, so I had read through it all, and there was absolutely nothing in there that I could really disagree with. And it all seems like common sense, and doesn't everyone know this? So for some people, the ideas were familiar to them, and maybe what was new was bringing it together into a framework, one framework. But then there were other people that struggled more at the beginning with the concepts of the framework, and this quote reflects this group. The whole way the framework was based in the beginning was tricky to understand because the dimensions all kind of flow together. And to take it and separate it, it's really hard. So for some participants, they had a much harder time wrapping their head around the framework. And some people even said it took months for them to feel they had a comfort with the language and with the framework. But regardless of the initial reaction, to the framework, many participants described the challenge of letting go of that project mentality to patient safety that Ross talked about. And they noted that they're typically used to working on a prescribed specific project, and this collaborative was really different in terms of taking a conceptual framework and translating it into practice. And even if they were given this message in the learning session, actually doing it was really challenging. So collaborative team members therefore had the responsibility of translating the framework to practice. And I'm going to talk about two main activities that were required. One was increasing understanding of the framework amongst the various stakeholder groups at their own settings, and then embedding the framework into local practices. So in terms of the local sharing and learning, there were various strategies that were used to do this work. And I'm going to highlight just 4 here, but they reflect the immense amount of energy, thought, commitment that was required to do this translation work. So the first, which might seem the most obvious, is more formal education. So teaching about the framework in any kind of meeting. So this could be senior board meetings, short learning sessions, at point of care rounds, so seizing the opportunities to talk about the framework. People also integrated the language into their daily interaction. So for example, bringing in the concepts of reliability, sensitivity to operations, anticipation and preparedness into their emails, into if someone had a safety concern, bringing that language into talking through the safety concern. So really embedding that in that day-to-day interaction. And people also talked about reflecting on the dimensions, bringing people together to talk about what do we tend to do well and what do we tend to miss. Overall, past harm, not surprisingly, was widely identified as being well established. And integration and learning was perceived as being challenging generally due to limited time and resources. The other 3, there was more mixed response of the familiarity and tendency to give more or less attention to those. And I'm sure you could all think about within your own context what might be more easier or challenging to think about. So for example, in acute care settings, people tended to say, yeah, we're more comfortable with anticipation and preparedness. For participants, the last point, adapting the framework language for local context, participants were really conscious of not wanting to add one more patient safety framework to a very demanding and crowded workplace environment and patient safety spaces in those environments. And they worked really hard to make the framework relevant and meaningful. For some, this meant co-constructing a new tool that didn't necessarily use the exact same language, but was based on the framework's ideas. So again, people had that independence and opportunity to do this work that was most relevant to their particular settings. So just some general points. This work was hard, required effort and commitment. Teams had to make decisions about how they would do this, and there were sometimes different opinions and approaches amongst those team members. And there was turnover on teams, which challenged this work. And people also noted that it was challenging to do this work when they themselves were learning about the framework. And this really evolved over time to develop that confidence to do this. So just, thinking back to that diagram of the collaborative that Wayne and I shared with you, the learning sessions and coaching over time were instrumental to this work. And I want to particularly call out the coaching. As one person said, I think it was really good to have the calls with the coaches as well as having the coaches come up to the site, because they really will push you a lot further. Like, you're doing okay, but then they can pick up on those things that you're missing, or if you've interpreted one of the dimensions a bit differently, can push you ahead. So in quality improvement work, we don't necessarily give enough attention to those coaches along the way and what coaching needs to look like in improving safety. And my last slide before I hand it over to Leora, I talked about that first stage of increasing understanding amongst the different stakeholder groups in one's organizational context. But then there is also that responsibility of how do you translate and embed the framework into workplace routines and structures. And so I'm going to highlight 5 examples to you. And this was really unique in what Ross and Wayne have both referred to in terms of we're taking this conceptual framework and asking people to figure out how it's relevant and can be incorporated in different spaces, different ways within an organization. So I'm going to give 5 examples that hopefully will make this a little bit more tangible for you. So the first one is huddles, and huddles were a commonly used approach to integrating the framework into practice. But the way it was done in the different sites differed. So for example, at one site, they used questions from the framework. Has patient care been safe? Are we safe in here today? Will care be safe in the future? As a way to organize their discussions in the round. And they said that doing this over time really changed the number of people participating in that discussion and the types of issues that were being brought up in those spaces. And another site, they did it a bit differently. They took the different labels, the different dimensions, and put those up on the board. And then when someone had a safety ticket, they were asked to place that safety ticket under one or more of the dimensions that were relevant to that safety ticket, and then speak to the safety ticket in that context. And again, people talked about how this shifted the conversation into what was important and relevant to know about, and also caused, encouraged people to think about how they might approach preventing that particular problem in the future. We also had examples where the framework was becoming apparent in board discussions and reports. So for example, we had one board member who said that they tended to be focused on watching targets and questioning when they weren't being met, and getting lulled, as that person said, into a false sense of security when they were meeting those targets. And after participating in the collaborative, they are now asking questions surrounding the data, asking different kinds of questions around the data they are already collecting, and then also having discussions about what should we be measuring that we're not currently measuring. An example of the incident reporting and investigation. So one team created a new tool as a way to document and discuss incidents. So they had questions. Has this happened before? Is there something in place that we could have done but didn't? Is there anything going on today that is different than usual? And knowing what we know now, how could we have predicted this? So those are all questions that are based on the framework. And again, people talked about that brought together different types of information in one place for people to have discussions around and to plan on how to prevent that incident from happening again in the future. We had a few different examples of the framework being used to target specific healthcare processes. And one of these was a team from a mental health unit context that were working on an intervention in the area of suicide risk assessment at different points of time in a person's hospital journey. And they said, they very much acknowledged we would have done this anyways, even if we weren't part of the collaborative. But being part of the collaborative and having the language and of the framework allowed them to identify certain dimensions, in particular reliability around how they implemented that process, and integration and learning, how they worked with healthcare providers in implementing that process and bringing the learning back to them and getting their input that they wouldn't necessarily have attended to as explicitly and consistently in the past. And then finally, my last example, there was a lot of activity around patient, resident, and family initiatives and bringing the framework into those kind of, that way of thinking and efforts. And so, for example, at one long-term care facility, the staff started to ask residents, what makes you feel safe today? And again, there's a different way of approaching safety rather than making assumptions that we all share the same conceptualization of what makes us feel safe in this particular day. And then they brought that information back to their huddles. So again, I just want to reiterate before I pass this over to Leora that this work was ongoing. I'm sure if we followed up now, we'd get different examples, coming up, but it was required a lot of effort over time. Alex, can you pass it to Leora now?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Joanne and Ross and Wayne. I am going to talk now about some of the experiences and the outcomes of participating in the collaborative and working to integrate the framework into practice, and some of the implications and opportunities that we found moving forward with the collaborative. So in terms of outcomes and the impact of working through the collaborative, participants really did report a range of outcomes, and some did share some concrete measurable outcomes, increase in patient satisfaction, increases in safety reporting, incident reporting, decreases in staff injuries or safety events. But I would say across our interviews, most of the participants really felt that the more meaningful outcomes of the framework were really difficult to measure, but nonetheless really did have an impact on patient care and safety. And so I'm just going to speak to some of the key outcomes of participation. So firstly, our participants really did feel that staff were more engaged with thinking about patient safety, with working on patient safety efforts, and it was just became more top of mind across these teams. So they talked about really engaging and participating in the huddles, bringing their safety concerns to the huddles. There were examples of concerns coming earlier than they normally would have. So staff weren't necessarily waiting until something happened, but felt that they could bring these concerns earlier. And not only were they bringing concerns earlier, they really wanted to be engaged with understanding it, using the framework to think through these concerns, and wanting to be involved in the solutions. They also described deeper and more open conversations about safety. So staff were more willing to discuss safety, and the conversations were more holistic. So Joanne spoke about the safety huddles and using the dimensions of the framework to speak and think about safety, and that was really evident in the way a range of people spoke about safety. And also, as Joanne mentioned, there were some groups that really worked hard at including patients and families and residents in these conversations and using the framework to have the language and the tools to speak openly about safety with residents, and giving staff permission to be open about safety with residents really moved these conversations forward. And finally, there really was a sense that people were approaching measuring and monitoring safety differently. So a lot of people spoke about comfort with the idea of past harm, but now there was more legitimacy to thinking about understanding safety in a more holistic way, so moving past soft harm, thinking about different, what they called soft intelligence, so asking those questions, are we safe today? Are we going to be safe tomorrow? And one manager talked about how she found her staff, what she called were using their spidey senses. So we're really thinking about what doesn't feel right, something doesn't feel right, and really allowing those staff to be open about those senses. And a couple of quotes to illustrate this. One manager explained that the staff are not just doing their tasks. Now they're actively more engaged and thinking, oh, that might be an issue and maybe we need to talk about this issue. And then a senior leader from another organization explained that it's less about those measurable items to me and more about how conversations changed. The framework changed some of the focus of the safety work, and he and said, I'm a tough sell on some stuff, but I'm kind of sold. So there really was this sense that there was a change happening with these teams. We also asked our participants to share their experience with trying to spread the framework beyond the local teams and trying to scale it at a more organizational and regional level. And we heard a lot of really interesting and exciting examples of how the framework was being spread, most unplanned or planned local spread. So for example, with these huddles, people were seeing the huddles and the benefits of the huddles, and more people wanted to join the huddles. They became more interprofessional in some locations, or other units were hearing about the huddles and took some of the strategies of the huddles and brought them to their units. So those were examples of sort of more unplanned local spread. There was an example of a more planned local spread initiative where at the one organization, the team of quality improvement specialists that work at more of a regional level started learning about the framework as a team and practiced together using the framework to address patient safety concerns until as a team they felt really comfortable using the language and using the framework. And then they were given the capacity and the resources to present about the framework with the different teams they work with across the region. And if those teams were interested, these QI specialists were able to work with them, and there were some nice examples of other teams starting to work with the framework. In our interviews, we saw less organizational or regional scale of the framework. This was seen as more challenging or something that people were thinking about but weren't quite ready to do it. One senior leader spoke about how he was working with a partner community hospital in the same region to introduce the framework, but that work was still in the planning phase when we were interviewing. We did hear one nice example of an organizational-wide initiative to implement the huddles that were informed by this framework. So at an organizational level, they created standardized safety huddle boards and trained all the managers in how to use the framework to guide the huddles, and it's currently being taken up across the organization. So there were a couple of examples, but really people spoke to the challenges of spreading and scaling the framework, the dedicated resources and the time it takes to learn about the framework, to understand the framework. There were challenges around taking these very local and context-specific applications of the framework and then adapting it to other areas, and then the organizational alignment. So often people felt that the framework were butted up against organizational structures and processes. And I think this quote really exemplifies this. One senior leader explained that as an organization, I think it needs to be bigger to be successful. It can't just be one or two areas, and then the ministry has to be on board as well, because their language for critical incidents is different than ours. And so if we want to focus on this framework and the data they're asking us for, it just doesn't match. If I go to talk about critical incidents with the emergency department, they have no clue what I'm talking about. So there really was a sense that to really embed this framework beyond the local practices, there had to be change at a more organizational or regional level. So just a few concluding points. As we've mentioned, the measuring and monitoring of safety framework is a new approach to safety, and it is a conceptual framework. And for it to be implemented into practice at the local level, there really was intensive learning and local experimentation needed, and that was supported by the Learning Collaborative and the coaches. But this really did require time, resources, and capacity to do the work. We saw with all the different initiatives that Joanne spoke to and the outcomes that were reported that there really is, we felt, potential for the framework across a range of settings and professional groups. But we did feel the tension and the need to balance those context-specific efforts to implement the framework into practice and sort of more consistent organizational spread. And finally, as I mentioned, lots of evidence of local spread, but further work is required to really take it to that next level where it is impacting at a wider group or wider institutions or regions. And so based on these findings, we do believe that there are a lot of opportunities to move this forward. And I think based on what we heard about the amount of energy and work that went into the learning collaborative, the coaching, and the teams really working through this model, we are thinking about new learning and coaching models to really be effective in the way that the model is shared with teams. And to enable this, we need ongoing research into the implementation across different settings and different professional groups with the idea of really trying to highlight those key ingredients in how the framework is taught and supported, both in formal learning and in applying it in practice. Organizational support, like we said, this takes time and capacity. So organizational support to keep allowing these teams to work on the framework to support sustainability and spread, but at the same time, the engagement of senior leaders and scholars thinking about how the framework fits at a more regional or organizational level is needed. So I think we need to both balance local work and organizational work and allow those to work together to really increase the reach of this framework. So that is our findings from the evaluation, and we're really hoping to hear your thoughts and your questions around the framework. So we're going to pass it over to Ross and to Christopher, I think, or if Ross, you're going to be doing a discussion.
So Christopher, I think you had some questions.
Yes, absolutely, Ross. Thank you so much. And thank you, of course, Joanne and Leora and Wayne. Of course, we can't forget him from the beginning setting the stage. We have been receiving other questions from the chat box, so I figured we could open up the floor to all of our speakers. The first one actually came in for you, Ross, if you don't mind answering. At what organizational level do people need to be involved in order to either implement these changes or even start thinking about learning about the framework? Where should people be in their organizations?
So that's a great question, and I think it's a really important question. We recruited frontline teams to participate in the collaborative projects, both the one that finished this March and then the previous one. And we did it from various clinical areas because we wanted to see if it made a difference, if it was acute care or long-term care or community-based care. And so that was an intentional design. But at the same time, we reached out to senior leaders, to board members. Some of the teams had board members on them to observe what was happening. Some of them had patients and family caregivers on them as well. So I think we think now that this work has to happen at all levels of the organization, but it's enormously helpful to have local examples of teams that are working to translate the model into their local environment and to understand what they need, what help they need, assistance moving forward. So it's not as simple as saying, you have to start at the senior leadership level or you have to start at the front line level. You really have to have some activity in all those different areas, but you also have to recognize that the critical piece here is a translation by frontline teams of this model into ongoing actions and conversations that they have with each other on a daily basis to protect safety.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much, Ross. I did have a question come up for Joanne and Leora, if you don't mind. Regarding adaptation of the framework to local contexts, how did it capture and respond to these diverse contexts, like local communities trying to navigate societal and individual impacts of illness, safety concerns, etc.? How did the framework adapt to local context and capture and respond to those? Maybe muted. I can't hear a response.
So just to clarify the question, so it's how were they able to adapt the framework to different contexts?
Yeah, how did they capture the feedback and then adapt the framework?
So I would say there was, in terms of the process around it, there was a lot of work in working with those the different stakeholder groups within their own organizations around increasing understanding, and then working through together in terms of the different stakeholder groups, how can we think about applying this framework to our particular context? So they had to make that decision around, where can we see this appearing, whether it's in huddles, for example, or specific care processes, or with family and, caregivers and patients and residents. So I would say that was the challenge and the opportunity of the framework, was to do that deep thinking around how do we take the framework and adapt it to the different contexts. And I would say that's the beauty of the framework and that opportunity to, and that was the work that they had to think about how to make it relevant to that context. So I'm not sure if I'm really answering the question.
Yeah, I hope so. I think you gave a quite a facile response there. How about we pop over to Leora for the next one to get sort of a balanced perspective. Leora, can you tell us how you measured whether people were more open? What changed with the framework? And there was a corollary question there. How or what questions did you ask participants to measure experience? So how did you test them? How did you get these responses out of them? What kind of questions did you ask?
Absolutely. So we approached this using a qualitative research framework. So we used semi-structured interviews to talk about people's experience through the framework. So our aim in doing these interviews was really to speak to all of the team members to get a sense, firstly, of their impression of the framework, their understanding of the framework, and how they worked through the framework to try and understand it, to try and apply it. So we asked them a lot about the framework and their specific understanding of the different dimensions of the framework. And then we asked them for examples of how they took the framework and put it into practice. I think part of the question was, how did we measure the experience? We didn't have a specific measure in our evaluation. We really did take a qualitative approach to that.
Understood. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Leora. Go ahead.
Christopher?
Is there somebody else that wants to speak?
Yeah, it's Wayne. I was just going to add to that. I mean, one of the things that we tried to do right from the beginning with this initiative was, right from day one, we asked people to suspend their desire to want to do a project and to go back. And they really spent the first 6 months having discussions within their area around safety, trying to explore what safety meant to staff. And we used a tool called the maturity matrix to work with teams to examine and explore what levels different people felt that their organization or their care area was with respects to maturity around safety. And that tool became one of the real instrumental tools that we kept going back to the teams with. So I think, the question around the measurement, this functions differently than what we would have seen in our typical, safer healthcare nowadays, where we would be measuring, auditing, how many people had the right elevation of a bed at if they're doing ventilated for pneumonia, protocols and things like that. So we were trying to get at other aspects of measurement than we would have typically gotten at with respects to working with the teams.
Great. Thanks so much, Wayne. I actually do have a follow-up question for you that came in. How can we use the results that you see, the results from these reports, the findings, to support changes championed by the Canadian Patient Safety Institute?
Is that to me, Christopher?
That's to you, Wayne.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think, for me, this is a very exciting process to be involved with. I mean, 30 years working in healthcare, it was incredible to be on these units during that period of the 18 months and see these teams really transform from standing there and just listening and not saying anything to going back, near the end of this and seeing teams fully engaged in the conversations, and organizations that then utilize this kind of escalating ability where, things were talked about in safety huddles in the morning and got escalated up the organization. It was truly transformational. And I think that, one of the fundamental things we kept hearing when we were working with teams was, we don't have enough money, we can't do this. And we would go back to the teams and say to the teams, yes, we hear you, lots of people don't have staff, lots of people don't have money, but what is it that you can do as a frontline provider to help make the care that you're providing safe? And when you went back to that kind of seed of kind of just opportunity, people became very creative and they brought forward really interesting ideas. And then through the learning sessions, people were able to share these ideas back and forth, which really made the learning sessions quite a wonderful time. And we got pictures of, like, people had Monopoly games, people had voting booths. I mean, it was just incredible, the different things that people shared. So it really is about giving back to people the opportunity to be engaged and to do things that they really want to do for their clients, which is to keep them safe.
Great. Great. Thank you so much for that, Wayne. We have a number of great questions that are in the queue. We're going to provide these to our speakers and come back with them and give a little bit more fulsome a reply. But in the interest of time, I just want to do one more sort of a wrap-up question posed to each of you. Let's start with Ross. If you were going to give one word of advice to teams interested in introducing measurement and monitoring of safety framework into their organization, what would it be?
So I think that's a really important question, Christopher, and it really is the question that we've been working on, for over 4 years now, in this various initiatives to understand the application of the framework to clinical settings across the country. And so the issue is about what we've learned, trying to move away from being purely conceptual to being more practical, to come up with examples and approaches and tools that allow teams to really grasp the issues moving forward. And there's a lot of credit that has to be given to Virginia Flintoff and Ann McLaren and Wayne Miller working with our English colleagues to create learning strategies that allow teams, facilitate teams in doing that. We've learned a lot about that moving forward. So I think there's still some ways to translate those tools into materials that are going to be easily accessible by the team. So that's one thing. The second thing is really understanding that there is this tremendously valuable role of coaches that Joanne and Leora referred to in helping to make that translation happen quickly. So at an organizational level, I think the critical issue is develop a small cohort of people from existing quality and safety staff or other people who are interested in this framework, who understand the framework well, who understand some of the tools to learn and apply the framework, and who can work and coach people to use this approach moving forward. And I think, you know, like any other large safety and quality initiative, you need some support to help teams on the front line and to really translate this into a set of learnings that can be interpreted by leaders in the organization and really aligned with their strategic work moving forward. So it's not simple, but it's something that I think is really a critical step in taking something like this and moving it into practice.
Oh, no, if it was easy, it'd already begun. I understand. Thank you so much, Ross. Joanne, how about yourself? If you were going to give one word of advice to teams interested in MMSF, what would you share with them?
I would probably share the excitement about this use of a conceptual model and having those opportunities to really engage with it, you know, from a conceptual, you know, getting your different ways of thinking and translating that into practice. So investing in the people and the team to do that translation work and thinking about the opportunities of this kind of conceptual approach to patient safety.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much, Joanne. Leora, what would you add? What word of advice would you give to teams interested in MMSF?
I think I would definitely agree with what Ross and Joanne were saying, and maybe expanding on it a bit is I found speaking to people, what teams and the people who are really involved with the collaborative found really helpful was having time with others who were trying to learn the framework and really just talking about it and thinking about it and having dialogue about it to really try and unpack each of the dimensions and really taking specific examples from their lived experience and trying to integrate it with the dimensions and doing that collectively.
Oh, fantastic. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Wayne, let's come back to you. Can you give one word of advice to teams who are interested in MMSF in their organization?
I think my word of advice would be to suspend some of the previous kind of paradigms that we have about how things change inside of organizations. People want to do right. They really do want to do right by their clients and their patients, and they want to be engaged in patient safety. And you know, providing the opportunity for them to do that, as opposed to seeing this as a technical exercise, it's a relationship exercise. It's about helping people to be fully engaged, and I think that to me would be one of the secrets of this process.
Yep, I would have to agree with you wholeheartedly, Wayne, there. Thank you so very much. I can see that we're at time now, so we do want to respectfully thank Wayne Miller, Dr. Ross Baker, Dr. Joanne Goldman, and Leora Rateau for sharing their time and their expertise. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to attend. On behalf of me, Christopher Thrall, technical host Alex Titia, and the rest of the team here, please take a moment to respond to the survey that has popped up before you leave. If you do want to continue the conversation starting this discussion, please feel free to send us an email. We will forward your comments as well as the questions we just didn't get to in this seminar onto our speakers. We will also post a recorded copy of this webinar on the CPSI website in the next week or so. Join us online at patientsafetyinstitute.ca for additional resources. Search measurement and monitoring and check for the report to be published next week. But while you're there, please make sure to register for Canadian Patient Safety Week, running October 26th to the 30th, featuring a virtual care theme, as well as a webinar on the upcoming Canadian Quality and Patient Safety Framework. I'll hope to see you there. Have a wonderful day, everyone. We look forward to seeing you again.